So I had a really fun day yesterday, and if anyone knows me, it's not often I have a really fun day. And I know a lot of people are going, like, why have you not uploaded in a while? Well, basically, I've been waiting for a book to arrive that's on a subject that I wanted to do a video of. And it was supposed to be here several days ago. And I'm still waiting. Most mornings you will find me sat by the door waiting for it. And I was kind of sat there going, well, I still want to do something, even if it's not a heavily edited video. Like, let's do a podcast, okay? Let's do what we did with, like, the Gwen Stacy video. Like, let's just sit here and talk. I may flash something up on the screen, because what I want to talk about does involve, a couple of sources and books, so I may flash those up, but probably not. So, during my fun day yesterday, somehow I got to talking about, what I do. And a friend of a friend, because I was over at someone's house for dinner, asked, what is my favourite thing to teach? And I said, oh, most of my students like talking about, like, the medical and future applications for technology. And I said, what I love to teach, though, is what students don't find very interesting, which is transmedia storytelling and intertextuality. Thankfully, this person knew what I meant, and their first question was, what's your favourite form of transmedia storytelling? And this is where life gets fun, because the first thing I could think of was Star Wars. And I got this really confused look from them. It's like, what do you mean? They went, oh, the modern comics. I went, no, it's history. And I thought you guys would love this. Everyone knows the original trilogy of Star Wars. And when it was originally produced, the first film was produced, they didn't think it was going to go very far, because it was kind of a niche genre. They thought it was mostly going to be aimed at teenage kids and maybe younger ones, and that was it. It would just go by. But what they decided to do is they asked Marvel Comics, like, we've got this, this property we're not too sure is going to happen with it. Do you want to just, take the plot and characters and make a comic out of it? Do you want to adapt the first film and then just kind of run with it? And they did. Which is great, because by the time the film premiered, there was already 3 issues of that comic out on the stands. And it was some of the first comics to sell over 1 million issues since the Bill Dozier 1966 Batman days. It was a phenomenon, and what was great is you're living in a time where you don't really have, VCRs or anything like that at home. So if you wanted to watch a film, you had to go back to the cinema or hope it was on TV. So what would happen is you'd get these kids buying up all the comics so they could relive this film that's now just a sensation. So what I thought would be great for this kind of little podcast is I would revisit something I briefly offhanded mentioned, I think, last episode, which was my undergraduate dissertation. I wrote about this, and I think it's a fascinating subject, and I just wanted to share it with you guys. So there's going to be a lot of Star Wars talk, maybe a little bit of X-Files, and what was the third subject? The Matrix, yes. So maybe first I will describe what transmedia storytelling is. Transmedia storytelling allows for a story to be told across a multitude of platforms. So you may start off a story in a film and that may continue into a TV show, but then, say, one character in there gets a spin-off series in a comic, but it all relates to the same universe. That is transmedia storytelling. And what's great is, a lot of this comes from fan outcry at some points. They want to see more of the world. And one of the best examples I can ever bring up for fan outcry is actually Sherlock Holmes. It was Arthur Conan Doyle who actually killed Sherlock Holmes in The Final Solution. And 16 years later, he was brought back in The Adventures of the Empty House in 1903. This was 16 years after he'd killed off Sherlock Holmes. And that was due to fan outcry. So fans do hold a lot of power when it comes to this stuff. It's, with transmedia storytelling as a franchise, it's referred to as, the audience becomes a participant. They can choose how much they want to be engrossed in the story. If you just like a TV show, then you can just watch that. But if you want to absorb every part of that universe, then you have the option to go into books, comics, or anything else produced related to it. And this actually comes from, if you listen to 2003 by Henry Jenkins, he coined the term transmedia storytelling, and it comes from a Japanese practice of media mixed culture, which actually comes from Astro Boy, like Osamu Tezuka's Tetsuwan Atama, which we know in the West as Astro Boy. And it's cited as being one of the first examples of mixed media, because you would have the manga or comics in this case, and then you would have some of the first anime on TV, and they were all kind of connected. But it's often stated that for a transmedia franchise to be successful, it must offer choice. You can't say that everything is 100% necessary to even remotely understand something new. The longer an audience member wishes to remain in that universe, then great. The greater the franchise's perceived worth. Henry Jenkins described transmedia storytelling most simply as being the art of world building. While a film or television project could be said to already inhabit this principle, the use of transmedia storytelling opens a new door within the great realm. So it's all about how much the audience is willing to discover. And a very strong example of transmedia storytelling in action is actually the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, bearing in mind, when I originally wrote this, we didn't have the Netflix TV series. So I was originally referring to the films, and then the little shorts you've got on the DVDs and the Blu-rays, so like item 41, I think it was, and then a funny thing happened on the way to me on there. But now we also have the Netflix series, so we have these television shows that not only tie into each other, but tie into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think we had Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. at the time I wrote this. I'm pretty sure we did, because I was watching it at the time. Yeah, I must be. And that was a primary example, because everything that happened in the Cinematic Universe affected the episodes. And what was great about living in England, where there's a bit of a time delay, is there is an episode, I think in the first season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. that ties into Thor the Dark World. And I saw Thor the Dark World a little late, like in its third, fourth week. And the episode that ties into it happened to come out in England, like the day after I saw it, so I was very happy with that. So yeah, that's just a little thing on my part. But what's great is Hollywood is kind of... They've been a little loose about adapting comic books in the past, but now that the comic book medium has kind of become a staple in Hollywood, I mean, we have Justice League coming out in a couple of weeks, Thor Ragnarok, I think I saw 2 weeks ago, that was absolutely fantastic. Like, we are more and more relying on comics. But comic books can and have provided the opportunity to discuss a wide and varied range of subject materials, as a form that can both reveal the mindset and the thinking of its characters, and also has a robust language for action. While the superhero genre is the most prominent in the comic book media, there are also several points in history where romance and horror comics have outsold their superhero counterparts, particularly after the Second World War. Despite the consensus that comic books are solely restricted to superhero and action-adventure subjects, perpetuated with big-screen adaptations of Kingsman: The Secret Service and The Dark Knight, it's important to remember that they are incredibly versatile, that the message should never be mistaken for the messenger. The genre possibilities for comics are just as open and broad as those available to film or television. Comics can and have explored multiple genres, characters, and themes, including like real-world reenactments such as Mouse, which obviously took place in World War II and is just a stunning piece of work in itself, but then could also include the sweeping space drama like The Ballad of Halo Jones by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. Gibson, rather. I keep saying Gibbons, it's Gibson. I'm so sorry. Some film and television shows are adaptations themselves of properties that may not appear to be even related to comics at first glance, such as the French film Blue is the Warmest Colour and The Diary of a Teenage Girl, which just strengthens the proof of the comic book medium's versatility. This is the problem. When I say to someone comic books who isn't really a comic book reader, they assume the only thing I'm talking about is superheroes or action fare. But there is so much that could be told through comics that just makes it such a versatile medium. It's just as, if not more versatile, as TV and film, or even books. I hate when people kind of stronghold comics into being just one thing, like they must be action-orientated. But the great thing is that the more people are realizing it, the more they realize they can use comics for this medium of expanding a world that has nothing to do with superheroes. So despite the wide variety of choice genre-wise, the most common genres used for adaptation and transmedia purposes are actually like science fiction and fantasy. The science fiction genre in particular is one that never fades. It may pass out of fashion for a time and only return in updated garb, as Broadwell and Thompson put it. If you are a film student, I'm sorry, I just brought up Broadwell and Thompson. I'm not even a film student and I can't stand hearing Broadwell and Thompson. The science fiction and fantasy genres are already open to world building thanks to their origins as evolutions from fantastic voyage tales. And so it's natural that they would be the most frequently experimented with in the transmedia practice. However, the idea of a tie-in comic may be seen in some circles as relatively unremarkable and of little interest to any other than die-hard fanboys looking to fill the gap between television series, as Danny Fingeroth puts it. Nevertheless, they can also be seen as examples of what Henry Jenkins refers to as metatext, offering readers a chance to experience the characters and hallmarks of their series outside of the screen. While there are numerous examples of transmedia storytelling in action, three notable entries, and the ones I kind of want to draw attention to today, are Star Wars, The X-Files, and The Matrix. Can you tell I'm a child of the 90s? I'm a child of the 90s who just remembered they have a cup of tea next to them. The Star Wars franchise provides both an early and prime example of transmedia practice at work. When Star Wars was in the process of being released, it became imperative that attention was drawn to the project through other medias due to the distributors' and executives' lack of faith in the project. It was decided that attracting early attention through comic books would be an ideal choice. And approaching Marvel Comics Stan Lee and later Roy Thomas with the proposal for a 6-issue adaptation, distributed so that the 3rd issue would be available before the film opened. This culminated in a 107-issue run, spanning all 3 films, the time in between, and the aftermath. At the point of issue 7, the comics transitioned from an adaptation to a transmedia franchise. With the phenomenal success of the first films, the Star Wars comics became some of the first since the Batman, Dozier, Finger, and Sampler Jr. days of 1966 to 1968 to sell over 1 million issues. The Star Wars adaptation brought a whole new interest to comics in a decade where there was much... I really can't speak today. The Star Wars adaptation brought a whole new interest to comics in a decade that was, for the most part, a slow one, thus cementing Star Wars as a prime transmedia franchise incredibly early in its lifetime. It's worth noting that at the time, the printed comics were the only way to re-experience the Star Wars films without returning to the cinema until their eventual home release, leading to comics' high sales rate. Marvel used this opportunity to expand the franchise's lore through the use of its characters, mythology, and settings, and while the franchise was still young, provided a number of baselines for later entries. With the constraints of writing around both Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, and Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, the comic was able to develop and explore details that the films could not explore due to time and budget restraints. The great thing about comics is what you can show is not restrained by your budget, it's restrained by what the artist can draw in your imagination. And even then, probably very good ways of getting around it if the artist is good enough. But focusing and developing on stories with the rebels dodging the Empire and thus the surrounding movies, fighting one-off aliens, rogue Imperial, barons, and bounty hunters, with the comics having to wax and wane between adapting a new movie and telling original stories. I kind of think of this as the modern anime practice, where they're trying to adapt a manga but then they catch up to it, and you have these long filler arcs. Like, that's probably the best example I can give. Especially if you look at, say, Dragon Ball Z or Naruto, or something that just had insane filler arcs. Through the adapted and expanded work, the comics were able to keep that prior work alive, giving it an afterlife, thus retaining interest in the property during the absence between films. The impact of the original Marvel run could still be seen, not only in the franchise's comic book successes, but also in the most recent entries, The Force Awakens, and now Rogue One, and then soon The Last Jedi, which I cannot wait to see. I have my tickets booked. I'm seeing Force Awakens, and then at midnight I'm watching The Last Jedi, and I can't wait because I booked mine like 3 days after they went up, and I can't believe I got tickets. No, most noticeably in its depiction of a looming threat arising after the Empire's falls. The initial Marvel run was one of the first entries in what is referred to as the Expanded Universe, the collective term for the Star Wars franchise, crossing multiple films, comic books, novels, such as Heir to the Empire, specials, cartoons, and video games, including The Force Unleashed. Essentially, the definition of a transmedia franchise. By 1987, Marvel had ended its run on the franchise. Merchandising came to a halt by 1985. Star Wars fever had largely subsided. During the beginning of the 1990s, Dark Horse Comics had come to acquire the license with Star Wars Dark Empire from 1991 to 1992. They proved themselves more than capable of maintaining the expanded universe, as well as breathing new life into a franchise by reigniting interest. Many have come to hold the Dark Horse entries in a high regard, able to stand head-to-head with the classic films in regards to quality. Despite the casual film fan remaining largely ignorant of the expanded universe, or having little to no desire to dive into the material that provided the franchise with a far greater level of depth than the films could alone. With the acquisition of LucasArts by Disney in 2012, the previously built expanded universe became non-canon. However, Disney still understood how vital transmedia is to the Star Wars franchise, and used its previous acquisition of Marvel to explore this universe once again in a way that is compared to Marvel's earlier excursions. While each form of media provides a coherent story and would allow to reference the other, knowledge of every form was not necessary for enjoyment, providing the audience with a choice that they are willing to explore. And what I think is great about Disney kind of using Marvel again for the Star Wars comics, I always found it hard to try and think about diving into the expanded universes, like, as a teenager. I wanted to, but every time I tried to look for something to read, I kind of felt very overwhelmed by the amount of choice, because I kept thinking, I'm going to pick something up, and it's going to end up being a sequel to something I can't find, and I'm not going to know what's going on, and I'm just going to hate it. I really am. I know I am. I'm going to get lost. And then when they started bringing out the new comics, I've recently been reading the first volume of the Jason Aaron Star Wars run, and then I read Mark Waid's Princess Leia, which was really good. I liked it, and I have a friend of mine who won't stop recommending the Darth Vader one. And I must admit, a little while ago, I was in a store and I was reading it, and there was this bit with, like, an evil C-3PO who goes to shake Darth Vader's hand, and then says, probably best not, because this is how I exterminate people, or something along those lines. And I must admit, it's high on my list of things to read. So if there's anything else in the Star Wars, like, comics universe you think I should read or anyone else should read, leave it in the comments, because I just want to read more stuff. I really do. But what's great about Star Wars franchise, and that as a transmedia example, is you can then look at something like the X-Files as well. Like, in the case of the X-Files, the franchise's use of transmedia provides a contrast to that of Star Wars in their choice of a serial-episodic structure in their comic books, a similar structure to their television show's own format. This would allow for installments to be presented or shown in an almost random presentation, with an episodic or serial-episodic structure in place when planning a transmedia world. Continuity and timeline become less of an issue. You could set any issue of a comic that's just one story anywhere in that timeline and not have to worry so much, because it's just an offhanded story. This structure enabled the comic books to focus on a consistency of characters and mythology, while experimenting with settings and events. In the comics industry, these are usually referred to as done-in-one adventures, something the Golden and Silver Ages used to great effect. The X-Files lends itself to the structure remarkably well, containing various revisited storylines across multiple series and films, known as the mythology episodes, and a multitude of standalone stories. With this familiar setup already in place, it allows fans of the series to easily move over to the comics, and for those introduced to the X-Files through the comics, to enjoy the series in a similar storytelling format. The episodic structure makes much more use of the audience's goodwill towards the characters as you visit them when all is normal, and not when they're facing certain death, thereby creating a deeper connection between the audience and the characters. The X-Files franchise was consciously built to be a cult series to attract the fan consumer market. With this cult status and fan base in place, expanding the narrative to new forms of media becomes a more attractive concept, as a dedicated fan base is ready to consume most media related to that franchise. With the television series being considered by many as the main continuity, the prospect of moving between screen and print may appear to cheapen the printed story perceived worth in the eyes of the consumer. This provides the challenge of proving the comic's worth, and that while the staple pages of words and pictures may seem material and culturally flimsy, they are just as film can be, a vessel which can hold any number of ideas. In the case of the X-Files, the choice was made to bring a form of authorial ownership to the comics by reproducing the distinctive font of the brand logo and a created by Chris Carter banner to the cover and the content. This decision ultimately brought a sense of worth to the comics that they may not have achieved otherwise. In addition to the seeming lack of authority that tie-in comics may display in relation to their parent medium, the difficulty also arises as to how the comic portray key characters. While this is a problem not entirely unique to the X-Files franchise, as most transmedia franchises that feature an illustrated medium will encounter it at some stage, the illustrated representation of characters are a key component in the original Topps comics' success. A large part of the character's identity is not only developed through the script, but through the actors and actresses interpreting them. The original Topps line of comics would most notably attempt to sidestep the limitation by providing photographic covers of each of the comics. However, this did not solve the initial problem, as the characters depicted in the story are clearly hand-drawn caricatures. While many would cite Gillian Anderson's physical performance as Scully as being the defining element of the character, her gestures and her voice are distinctly Anderson's. In contrast, comics lack motion. The artist must, in his or her way, conjure a representation of not only the character's likeness, but their behaviour and mannerisms in the form of a static image. A notable artist in the original line of Topps comics is Charlie Adlard, who used his interpretation of the character as an avatar limited in its capacity to evoke Gillian Anderson, but freed to expand upon the representational range of Scully. Adlard developed conventions of representing Scully that depicted the character's physicality and costuming without imitating Anderson's likeness, thereby using the example set by the actors as a framework in which to build upon, without betraying the essence or nature of the character. In a similar vein to that of the Star Wars franchise, the X-Files has seen a revival in both its comic incarnation and in its parent media, with a line of comics from publisher IDW continuing the series past its initial cancellation and the subsequent films, The X-Files I Want to Believe, I think that came out in 2008, The X-Files was able to live on through a medium where it already had a foothold. Which is amusing because our original interpretation of the season 10 and now season 11 of the X-Files actually came in comic form, with comic writer Joe Harris deciding to continue the series as a comic provides the awesome crossover appeal and potential this franchise brings to the publishing and the industry. Due to the franchise's cult following, many long-term fans who did not read the comics have picked the franchise up in the comic book medium in order to dive back into the series, according to an interview with Adlard in 2015. With the 2016 return of the X-Files to television, the creator Chris Carter wanted to once again tap into the cult fan base in the same way the comics did, stating, "This is for them," to Top L in 2016. The fan base for the franchise is what has kept the series alive, sustained by both the Tops and IDW comics until its much anticipated television return. And I believe the new series should be out next year, and I'm still trying to play catch up on that, I really do. But I must admit, I will recommend the X-Files Conspiracy, which is kind of a crossover comic with like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and The Crow and Ghostbusters. That was just really entertaining. I think that was my first introduction to the X-Files franchise. In contrast to both the X-Files and Star Wars, the Matrix franchise provides a stark warning as to what can happen when the core objective of transmedia storytelling is ignored, and that's choice. A transmedia franchise must offer choice to be successful. To discard this concept is essentially to do damage to the franchise as a whole. Through its use of film, anime, comic books, and games, may portray the Matrix franchise as a prime transmedia example, its execution was predicated on an audience having already consumed the previous media in the correct order. No film franchise has ever made such demands of its consumer, stated Henry Jenkins in 2006. When considering only the sequel films, events, and characters are presented with no explanations, assuming we have almost complete mastery over its complex mythology and ever-expanding cast of secondary characters, a mistake that is carried over to other relevant material. As The Matrix was being released internationally, the Wachowskis planned how a complete universe and story could be told through multiple media. Despite the plan to display this universe through many anime, comics, films, and video games, its execution expected its audience to seek out every single piece. That in order to understand the complexity of the movie's Matrix, one needed to purchase additional media. In the case of the second film, The Matrix Reloaded, there is no explanation as to what The Matrix is, why the main characters are important, or why the audience should care, before more important details concerning the plot are introduced. Secondary, seemingly one-off characters such as Kid are introduced with no explanation of their significance, other than those given in supplementary material, including Kid Story, an anime produced by Watanabe, who is most famous for Cowboy Bebop. While this would usually be an ideal practice if you are attempting to augment your storytelling world with supplementary materials, it is done so often throughout both The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolution that any member of the audience that had not sought out or was possibly unaware of the supplementary material was left without numerous instances and plot points explained. The fault with this execution is that the creators failed to provide one coherent story in just one medium. Its reliance on continuing plot lines in multiple media forms relegated it to notable failure. It was exceptionally transmedia. The franchise's reliance on multiple media to fill in gaps robbed the audience of the choice to dive in further, forcing them either to give up on the story or switch to a new medium completely. The creator's choice in regards to how they expand their narrative heavily reflects their own inspirations and influences. It's been noted several times by the Wachowskis that they drew greatly from anime such as Akira and Ghost in the Shell, as well as several comic books including Grant Morrison's The Invisibles. Morrison himself has stated that so much of The Matrix is plot by plot, detail by detail, image by image, lifted from Invisibles, so there shouldn't be much controversy. With this wealth of inspiration through various media, the director's choice to use these to their advantage became a natural evolution in the story. Anime shorts such as The Second Renaissance, which portrays the overthrow of humanity that led to the events of the film, and The Final Flight of the Osiris documents the final mission of the Osiris crew as told by the character Nairobi in The Matrix Revolution. Also, comic books such as A Life Less Empty, which uses a new character to contrast the possible life Neo could have led had he chosen the blue pill, and Deja Vu, focusing on a couple still trapped in the Matrix catching glimpses of the real world in their dreams. Despite the volume and talent behind the comics, however, they are the least known and distributed of the available media, while also being the franchise's best case for transmedia in action. The stories told through the comics are centered around background characters and events, providing readers with a connection to the world around the main characters, building a greater mythology for the franchise. Possibly the greatest artifact The Matrix has produced for an example of transmedia done correctly is the short comic, Bits and Pieces of Information. Though the comic consists of only 8 pages, it requires no previous knowledge of the film, of the franchise, and provides a look at the catalyst for the franchise's history. The events shown are presented as everyday occurrence, such as B116ER's achievement as the first robot to kill a human. That requires no knowledge of what came before or after, but is reflected in the story of the Second Renaissance and became the originating plot point for the Matrix films. The comic introduced the pivotal figure of B116ER. The Second Renaissance builds upon Bits and Pieces of Information, which both form the backbone of the first film. Though the manner in which The Matrix attempted transmedia storytelling lacked an understanding of choice, it is a flawed experiment, an interesting failure, but that its flaws did not distract from the significance of what it tried to accomplish. The transmedia storytelling has been used by numerous franchises to both a phenomenal degree of success and notable failure, with The X-Files, Star Wars, and The Matrix barely scratching the surface. There are multiple examples you could go out there and use. I think the Avatar show continued on as comics, and I imagine The Legend of Korra has as well. There are countless examples you can go for, and in fact you can list some of your favourites in the comments if you have any. But the film and television industry's embrace the comic book medium has allowed both industries the opportunity to expand their narrative in a way neither format could achieve on their own, additionally prolonging a franchise's lifespan by keeping the narrative alive, giving it an afterlife it would never have had otherwise. The comic book format, due to its versatility, can and has been used not only to expand an ongoing narrative, but to reawaken long-dormant properties and reintroduce them to their original audience and a wider demographic that may have missed the initial release, with a lower cost of entry and less risk than a multi-million-dollar film or television project. Unlike film, television, and games, comics give the possibility for a creator from outside the mainstream industry to reach a mass audience, and for creators to experiment with the narrative alongside with audience feedback, providing a more open dialogue between creators, producers, and fans. With this free exchange, the audience can feel as though they are taking a far more active role, as well as that of an explorer able to navigate as they wish and influence the course set before them. The future of transmedia storytelling, not only on the IMAX-enabled surround sound screens, but also in the 4-color pages, will be forged as a contributor between fans and producers, creating broad new horizons toward which an audience can choose to set sail. So that is one of the most fascinating subjects in my head. It's just transmedia storytelling in comics. And I have now been speaking for almost 40 minutes, and my voice is really starting to hurt. So I hope anyone like appreciated this or liked this or whatever. I'm sorry it's not more visual, but it was one of those things where the more I thought about it, the more I was trying to think of how would you edit that kind of video without breaking it into pieces, and I just love this whole subject as kind of one thing. This is why I chose to write about it in the first place, and why I want to expand on it later on in life. And if no one minds, I'm gonna go rest my voice and finish my cup of tea. Till next time.